Welcome to Lificast. This is the official podcast of the Leeds International Festival of Ideas 2022. And today we are talking about comedy. The question of what we're allowed to laugh at has been asked for a long, long time. But it seems now, more than ever, the consequence of crossing the line is far more extreme. A misjudged gag, a piece of satire, a comedy routine, or a flippant remark on Twitter can be fatal to a career, even to life. As cancel culture, freedom of speech and wokeness collide, where do we find that happy medium? Or is the purpose of comedy never to be middle of the road? Our question today, what can you laugh about? Joining us to discuss this is Professor Paul Wragg, Professor of Media Law at the University of Leeds, Director of the campaign group Hacked Off, and an expert on freedom of speech. Paul, hello.
Hi, Johnny.
Thanks for being here. We're also joined by Tom Clemance, comedian and host. You can find him at TA_Clemance and hosting several bid roadshows around Leeds right now. Hi, Tom. How are you?
Hello. Good, thank you.
And we're also joined by Octavia Maparura from KPMG. She's part of the Stronger Together network, which looks at ways to improve equality and diversity in businesses in the city of Leeds. Octavia, how are you?
Great, thank you. Yourself?
Good, thank you. Thank you for asking. I think you're the first to have asked me out of all of these podcasts. So take note, gentlemen. There we go. That is a lovely way to start the show with some courtesy. Right, so I want to start with you, Paul, if we can, because I guess comedy and people telling jokes and being a bit silly and all that kind of stuff probably centres around what exactly is it we're allowed to say. People always say, we live in a world full of freedom of speech and I can say whatever I want to do.
Yeah.
Does that hold any truth? Is there really such a thing as freedom of speech?
No.
Right. Thanks for coming, everybody. That wraps up today's Lificast. So where does the line start and end when it comes to freedom of speech?
So first of all, we need to think about what it is that we mean, what we're trying to say to each other when we assert a right to freedom of speech. Because there is such a thing as a right to freedom of speech, but it's what's known as a vertical right. It's a right that exists between the state and its citizens. It takes the form, really, of the absence of coercive power. So being able to speak without being unfairly incarcerated or unfairly fined by the courts for the things that we've said, for the things that we've published. But presently, we tend to use that phrase, freedom of speech, when we're talking to each other, when we're citizen to citizen. Now, the reason why the right is so important against the state is because the state is the ultimate bearer of coercive power. The state, through its police force, through its courts, can imprison me, it can fine me, it can bankrupt me, it can do all of these things. And that's why it's so important that we're able to exercise this right as against the state. But when we're talking about exchanging information, exchanging ideas, just talking to each other, this phrase, freedom of speech, it doesn't mean what we think it means. What are we trying to assert when I say to you, I have freedom of speech and you can't stop me from talking? And that's the thing that I think we should talk about today as part of this.
Which is what we intend to do. So When it comes to comedy, as a comedian, Tom, do you consider freedom of speech? Because isn't it the as we touched on in the introduction to this, isn't it the role of comedy to push and provoke and agitate? And isn't that line always just a bit blurry about how far you can go? Isn't that the fun of comedy?
Well, I think the role of comedy is to make people laugh.
Yeah, that is probably the most important.
Yeah, and you definitely can agitate with comedy and you can upset and you can offend people, but if you're offending a disenfranchised group, like, are you making that disenfranchised group laugh? No, then it's not funny anymore, so you're not a comic. So, yeah, I mean, there is freedom of speech in comedy, but I mean, you can't just go around saying what you want. Like, that's not how life works. So why would it work just because you're on a stage with a microphone? Like, that doesn't grant you a right to offend people.
And what about within the workplace and community then? Are the boundaries different, Octavia, in terms of freedom of speech? And we've just heard there, and obviously from Paul, that freedom of speech is different to how we perceive it. But within the workplace, do you find that people are even more guarded when it comes to feeling able to share opinions, tell jokes?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the workplace it's really difficult because you're also governed by, values and things like that. So like, for example, at KPMG, we have certain values, and every organization will have its values. So I think when you think about freedom of speech or being able to openly speak the way you want to, it's very difficult because you kind of, I guess, governed by laws of, if I say this, will I get fired kind of thing? Or what does the company that I work for think about these kind of things? Luckily, where I work, we've been encouraged a little bit more, especially when it comes to diversity, to speak up because it's more of an education piece. People don't know unless, people in those positions, like somebody like myself of Black heritage, who's able to actually speak to maybe senior people in the firm who don't know about racial, diversity and racial situations that we face on a day-to-day basis. So I think it kind of, it depends on, I suppose, the angle that you come in. From a workplace perspective, I think it's more, for me personally, it's been more of like being able to speak up to educate others rather than saying, I'm going to say this because I don't, feel great about it or, and I'm going to offend somebody or anything like that. It's just more of an expression.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As Paul, as Thomas says there, though, about why would you want to pick on a certain group of people who are vulnerable or are less powerful? But comedy isn't black and white, is it? It's not always obvious if you are picking on a certain group. They might be the subject of a joke, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the point of the joke is to disenfranchise them even more. So there are grey areas when it comes to freedom of speech on stage or otherwise, aren't there? It's not as simple when it comes to comedy because it's much more nuanced.
Typically, the object of the aggression, as it were, in the 70s was the mother-in-law. So the mother-in-law was always the butt of the joke. But then there were also uncomfortable elements where groups were picked on, and that's where the sort of political message, I think, becomes slightly uncomfortable with comedy, because if comedy is trying to make a point, if the comedy is intended to be satire, then what you're really doing is making a political point, but you're doing it in a way that people will laugh at. But the laughing isn't the end of the comedy. You're not trying to just make someone laugh because you want them to feel good. You're trying to get a message across, and you think this is the more powerful way to go. So I think what we should be talking about is the context in which the joke is disseminated. And we've already sort of identified three, I think, which is social media, the workplace, or just on stage, as part of an entertainment experience, as it were. And we could, with each of those contexts, we could talk about the consequences. How does the law respond to each of these, and what should it do?
Could you see? We saw Joe Lycett. The police investigated a gag that he told a couple of months ago in Belfast.
Yeah.
As I understand, nothing further happened. They just looked into it. But is it possible to be arrested for saying something which isn't covered under that banner of freedom of speech? Well, it's certainly possible to be arrested. Let's take freedom of speech out of it for a moment, because freedom of speech... Sorry, okay, so is it possible? Could you be arrested for offending somebody?
Right, okay, so yes, you could, if that constitutes, for example, a public order incident. So the very famous case to media lawyers about 20 years ago, there's a street preacher who's saying that homosexuality is evil, it's devil's work, it's blah, blah, blah. And so having a big rant about homosexuality in a public place. Well, the police intervened to stop him because they were fearful that public disorder was about to break out. Now, subsequently, you might say, well, it's freedom of speech, well, he's entitled to his opinion. But actually, if there's a point at which civil unrest is about to happen, then yes, the police are entitled to step in. I think where the areas, where the issues have arisen recently is the controversy around, it's not even a police power. It's to do with a police statistical piece of apparatus called the recording of non-crime hate incidents. Now, non-crime hate incidents are used by the police, for example, in Northern Ireland, to measure the rise of sectarianism so that they can plan and monitor, be ready for sectarian violence, for example. But that stems from an individual or a group complaining about something because it's hateful. It's hateful against a specific group. Now, that can lead to the police knocking on someone's door, having a conversation with them to find out what's happened. And often this is reported, particularly in the right-wing press, as something outrageous, something Orwellian, something that is suppressing freedom of speech, and it's blown up into beyond all proportion. Actually, all the police are doing in those circumstances is just trying to find out what happened. If they decide that it is a hate incident, they record it as such. But it doesn't go on your record or anything like that because it's not a crime. It's just used by them for planning purposes.
So when it comes to being on stage, Tom, well, it doesn't even need to be on stage, just telling gags, making fun, whatever. And you spoke about why would you want to attack a disenfranchised group. I guess punching down is what a lot of comedians talk about, and gags should punch upwards. But just as much as it might be your right to do that, although you wouldn't do that, it's the right of the subject to be offended and to take action. And the action could be, look, I don't find you funny. The action could be to take to Twitter and take the mickey out of the comic. There is power still, isn't there, in those that might be the victims of the gag. So therefore, it's this dynamic where isn't everything equal?
No. I mean, not everything is equal, no. And also the people who have been like, you know, I don't want to name people actually. If you look at people who have been attacked on Twitter for making a joke that other people on Twitter don't like nothing else has happened. Like they get told on Twitter that they're a bad person and it stops there. Like people don't watch their specials on Netflix, people don't go to their shows anymore. But like a lot of the people that we're kind of talking about here who say really bad things on stage don't really face any punishment for it. Like they're still multimillionaires, they're still doing these huge shows, they're still getting a lot of praise from people, not me, but other people. So when we talk about like kind of, there's no repercussions from it really. Like you can still punch down at people and people will get angry on Twitter and people will get upset. But you kind of create this discussion that we're having now that is like, can you say that? Well, yeah, you can say that and people won't like it on Twitter, but they're still making millions. Like right now, there is no repercussions for being
So we're talking about
offensive.
cancel culture.
Yeah, talking about cancel culture. Like it doesn't really exist.
We can name them. I mean, so we could talk about Dave Chappelle, for instance, who had his Netflix special cancelled. It was still paid something like $60 million to make it. And then after it was cancelled, he sold out 5,000-seater theatres. So, you know, that's the cancel culture in action shows that actually it just means people get very angry and then they forget about it and carry on. Louis C.K., the comedian, for his sexual harassment of women is, again, selling out concerts. It's selling out theatres for his stand-up. So, yeah, in terms of cancel culture, is it really a thing? I don't know. Maybe it's just a way that people scream cancel culture when they get called out for offensive jokes.
Oh yeah, I don't think cancel culture is a thing.
No.
Like, or at least there's no one I'm aware of that has been cancelled and not deserved it. Like, you know, Jimmy Carr, Dave Chappelle, Ricky Gervais, none of them are cancelled. Like I say, they're all still making millions of pounds. I mean, if that's what being cancelled is, then I'd love to be cancelled.
Let's all
let's all say really offensive stuff and get millions of pounds. But no, there's no real repercussions from it. So it's kind of a weird question to ask in a way, because nothing happens. Like, these people offend them. But then you have comedians that don't do offensive things that I personally think are great. I mean, I'm just trying to think, Ed Gamble, like Josh Widdicombe, these are all comedians that don't say offensive things and they're very funny. Then you have Nish Kumar, Rosie Jones, like Joe Lycett, like you mentioned, all hilarious comedians from marginalised communities that tell jokes about those marginalised communities, and they're very, very funny. So if you're a cis white male making jokes about those communities, but you're just offending them and upsetting them, then if being cancelled on Twitter, like, surely that should make you look inside yourself.
So that's interesting though. So do you have to be part of that community to be able to tell the joke?
Yeah, I think so. I mean,
that's the question I was going to ask, to say, is it okay? Because let's say, for example, I watch a lot of black comedy. It's funny to me because it's relatable. But if somebody else was to talk about, like, black comedy who wasn't black, then I'll be like, oh, I somewhat take it to offense. The question of, is it okay if just because somebody is black and, talking about black issues or like, homosexual or whatever they might be and making jokes about it, does that make it okay?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends what they're saying, obviously, but like, I can't ever do a set of black comedy because I'm not black. So why would I do it? But like, Desiree Birch is someone who can make comedies about being in a black community that I find funny, but I don't find it relatable because I'm not black, but I still find it very, very funny. Yeah. But yeah, I think you have to be of a certain community to be able to make jokes about that community and not offend people in that community.
There was a YouGov poll, I don't know if anybody saw it, where off the back of it, Maureen Lipman was talking about cancel culture and saying that comedy is forever ruined because of cancel culture and people piling on Twitter. But it came as a result of 57% of people asked, as part of that poll that she was talking about, said that they censor themselves now on issues such as immigration, trans rights, gender equality, all that kind of thing. People are afraid to talk about it, they say. But and I just wondered, if people are afraid to talk about things and share opinions, does that push it further underground and create a more extremist viewpoint because people don't feel comfortable in sharing it? That's an argument for being able to say anything, I guess. But I just wonder, from your perspective, from within a community or from within a workplace or whatever, if people don't feel comfortable to say things, does that end negatively much further down the line?
I think people need to be bold enough to just kind of, in those different, demographics or backgrounds, to actually just speak up and educate. I think that's the important thing, because if it's not spoken about, nobody was really going to know about it. So, and I do think, it then just goes, underground, and then it becomes one of those kind of taboo subjects that people just, just don't talk about. But then I feel like for example, if somebody didn't know, like, about, racism or anything like that, or rather they didn't feel comfortable, approaching me and asking me those questions, how else are they really going to ever really know? So I think people just need to be brave enough. It is hard. It is hard because, it's something that you live every day by. I can't change the fact that I'm black, for example. I live like that every day. I face different, pressures, different upbringings, a whole lot of things that are quite different. But without me speaking about it, without me, and I think there's a little bit of a thin line. People get offended too quickly sometimes as well. And if somebody doesn't really know something, I feel like there's not really such as a silly question, especially if you're having like an open conversation. Yeah. You've got to be kind of having an open conversation, not kind of confronting somebody or being aggressive towards somebody, because that's when I think it becomes a bit of an issue. But if we're just having like a chat like this or something like that, and then, or doing a bit of research online, and just, because now we live in such a world where it's always evolving, there's always something new, different rights and all these things that come up. So I think people just need to be willing to See,
that's interesting bringing that up, because I remember in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, and the awakening to, yet again, I mean, how many times it has to happen, I don't know, but the awakening again to violence against black people across the globe, but particularly in America. And somebody was saying from the black community, I can't remember which organisation it was, but it was, don't put the responsibility onto black people. If you want to understand more about their culture, you have to find out yourself. And that doesn't that doesn't mean you're going up to people of colour and asking them about their experience. But then my viewpoint is, but you're the best people to talk about that, because that's a lived experience from your point of view. But I don't know, does it put pressure on any community that you're not part of if you're asking them about their experience? Does it put more expectation on them to explain themselves, and yet another inequality on them, because you're already battling everything else and now have to be the people that explain what's going on?
Yes, I think it is very difficult. And, you know, especially around the killing of George Floyd, one of the things I was hearing a lot from, you know, people of Black heritage was, I've had enough about talking about this. I'm tired.
Yeah.
And it is draining, you know, because it's not like it happened. That was the first time something like that ever happened. But yeah, I think it's a tough one, because there's got to be some people who can, you know, keep talking about it. And then one thing that we do like at work is allyship, right? So for example, you can be an ally, we can, you know, have conversations, and I can tell you a bit about my experiences and things like that. And when you maybe see something out there in the community, you can kind of think about, the conversations that we've had, and become an ally in kind of representing almost, you know, whichever, you know, community that you're trying to represent. So I think it's a two-way street. So we've got allies, people who are not of that particular, you know, whether it's background, race, whatever it is. And then you've got the people that are actually willing to kind of put out that, I suppose, that content, or to have those kind of conversations. But you will come across a lot of people who will say, you know, I'm tired of this, or this is really awkward kind of conversation. And I used to find it very awkward, to be fair, like having conversations about race, you know, amongst like white people. I'm like, oh, can I say that? Can I, you know, what are they going to think about me? Or, you know, that kind of thing. It was awkward, and I'm sure it's really awkward for a lot of people still, even now. But then at the same time, I feel you can't get upset about something that somebody doesn't know.
Yeah.
So unless you tell them, like, for example, even, you know, if you offend someone, not even talking about race or anything like that, it's a conversation, no, I didn't like that. And you kind of have a conversation, oh, I don't like that because of A, B, C, and D. And then the next time you hope that they're not going to do it. Because, you know, they've been educated to the degree to say, okay, this person doesn't like this, so therefore I'm not going to do it like that kind of thing. And I feel like it kind of works the same, you know, just having those, because if nobody knows, then really nothing's going to really be done about it. So I think there needs to be more people that can stand up and talk about some of these issues openly, and have spaces, I think, open spaces within the community whereby we can do this, things like what we're doing today, podcasts where, you know, it can be listened to loads of people, whether it's on the news or, you know, on larger platforms, so that it's easier for it, I suppose, exposed to the rest of the community or the world, wherever, you know, people can reach it. And I think that's why I really like social media. You know, even the whole cancel culture that we're talking about, I feel like a lot of it's kind of, one person might talk about it today and retweet it, then all of a sudden everybody's, you know, like retweeting. They might not even necessarily know the context of what actually happened, but because they kind of felt like, oh, okay, this person is, you know, saying something that's not right in the Black community, for example, and then everybody cancels them because social media's got that effect. So it's a good and bad thing, social media, I guess. So the good is the fact that you know, it's a large platform, you can reach thousands and millions of people. But on the other side as well is there's a lot of people behind the screens who are not educated as well. So so I think that education piece is really important.
You see, I'm not convinced about the benefits of social media.
Well, I was just about to say, because the thing about there's a lot of things about social media, but when we talk about comedy, for instance, back in the day, somebody who would share some really unsavory views, which go beyond the rights of freedom of speech, for instance, might play to a social club of 50 people. But now, you know, they can cultivate an audience of hundreds of thousands across the globe and say some really extreme things. The theory is online you can say whatever you want, and it's absolutely fine, Paul. So we can say what we want, we can laugh about what we want online. That's true, isn't it?
No.
No.
Okay. So social media was meant to bring us together, make us more enlightened, make us understand each other. So far as I can tell, all it has done is drive us apart, to exaggerate difference and to increase the sense of isolation that people have, particularly when they're engaging with social media behind their computer screens, because everything irritates them because it's just them and a computer screen. There's no opportunity for tone. There's no opportunity for body language, facial expression, the things that we use to change the meaning subtly of words. All of that is lost. When you've got a screen, you will see those words the way that you want to see them. And that is the problem. The other problem, of course, is that it drives out private spaces. It drives out the element of doubt. It drives out opportunities to forget, because things get recorded, stored online, and they stay there forever. And this is where I think cancel culture, which I agree, I'm not convinced it is a thing, but if it is, I think this cancel culture will play out in an employment context where an employee who's befriended lots of other employees through social media platforms says something that they probably didn't mean, or perhaps they did mean. It's either misconstrued or it's taken to be exactly what it is, and then comes into the workplace the next day. Management get involved, and now the manager's thinking, well, I've got a load of really disgruntled employees here because this guy said something on Twitter or whatever that's offended everyone. Now there, the question of free speech is more nuanced, because it starts to come into contractual relationships, values, the way that we treat each other in the workplace, the obligations that employers have in terms of the duty of trust and confidence, etc., etc. So there it becomes a question of opinions and how opinions should be received and dealt with in a harmonious community. But it's introducing issues that just didn't exist 15 years ago. You've got this evidence. It's not contested, it's there.
And that plays into the whole issue about what is funny now and what will be funny in 10, 20 years, because how many stories have we seen of people who put out a funny tweet 15 years ago when Twitter first began, and then all of a sudden in today's world, it's incredibly homophobic or incredibly racist or whatever. And that's the thing about comedy, isn't it, Tom, is that things change. And we are living in a revisionist period now where they're taking Little Britain off of the iPlayer, where you won't find Love Thy Neighbour, I'm pretty sure, played on any, even of the more obscure digital channels. But you can't necessarily predict, can you, what's funny now is going to be offensive in the future.
Yeah, I don't think you can predict it.
So what do you do about that then? I mean, is it right then that somebody would be cancelled, or whatever someone you want to use, because they put out something that they thought was funny 15 years ago and is now homophobic, for instance?
Should you be cancelled for that? Well, you should be given the opportunity to argue your point and show that you've changed. I mean, if you still hold those views, you should be, cancelled. But if you've changed in those 15 years and you've actively shown that you've changed, then there's no, I personally don't think that there's any reason those tweets should be brought up. Yeah. Unless it was, of course, to be brought up for you then to go, sorry, I don't feel like that anymore. If people want to hold someone to what they said 15 years ago, and what you were saying about it being documented, 15 years ago, I was 16. I pray to God no one holds me to account. I mean, when I was 16, I was saying things like, I'll never wear big brand clothes. And now I'm no, give me that Gucci. I love it. I think you can't really predict what's going to be offensive in the future, but also in a way you can, because you can just not attack marginalized communities, which seems to be the main thing that comedy from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, all the way through history. Like we were saying, Little Britain was 15 years ago and they were making this stuff. Matt Lucas was in blackface. Obviously that's not acceptable. I don't think it was acceptable then. I can't believe it got made then. It's kind of baffling that it got made then. Yeah. But it was a very juvenile comedy show. So I mean, you can. I think you can predict what's going to be.
Would comedy stay forever safe if we didn't take any risks of offending people? Because comedy inherently there's always a butt of a joke, isn't it? Yeah. There's always somebody who's the end of that joke who people are laughing at. Now, whether it's an entire community or a single person or whatever, there's always somebody that's the butt of a joke. So doesn't then comedy cease to be risky in any way if you try and mediate any risk whatsoever that people, particularly in the future, are going to be offended by?
Well, I think I could make like a risky joke about like the Conservative Party, and people maybe in 15 years that'll be looked down on, but I doubt it. Like,
what's there to joke about in the current?
I mean, it's just so easy. But like, I think, well, like, yeah, in 15 years, are you going to look like, if you look back on the stuff you say and you still agree with it, then there's a chance you haven't grown, but there's also a chance that just like what you said 15 years ago, you do still agree with, and that's fine. I don't think there's any loss of risk though, because I think any risky comedy that I've seen that I've enjoyed, I don't think it's been punching down on people. And again, I think that's the main crux of it. Like, if you're punching down on people, that's not particularly risky comedy, that's bullying.
Right.
So, and I mean, there's an ample amount of people that you can punch up at that it's hilarious. Like, if you want to make a joke about racism, why not make jokes about racists, rather than black people? Like,
which is what Ricky Gervais, for instance, talks about, though, when he tells what many people say is an offensive joke. This is what the point of it is. There is an irony to it. People know that I'm coming down on the wrong side, and people are laughing at me for making a gag about transgender people, for instance, because I'm the one who shouldn't be making that gag. And that's what makes that gag even funnier. But maybe that's an excuse to tell jokes about transgender people. I don't know.
That feels revisionist to me. I think the question is a good one, though, because when we talk about free speech, what is it that we're talking about? We seem to just tell the story of free speech from the speaker's perspective. Well, I should be able to say something without consequence. Well, what does that mean? If I'm saying I should be able to say something without consequence, I'm actually silencing you three, because what I'm saying is there should be no opinion expressed by you that expresses a different view to mine. If I take that opinion, I mean, it's fine if you agree with me, but if I then take that opinion to be a consequence that I don't like, well, you're silencing me, you're cancelling me. Actually, I'm trying to cancel you by saying that. And so the point is that free speech has never been thought to be something that's consequence-free, the ability to do something that's consequence-free. It's a discussion about what those consequences should be, the level of those consequences. So if I say to you something that you find offensive, that's in poor taste or whatever else, and that's as far as it goes, it just changes your opinion of what you think of me, well, what's the problem with that? If it leads to the three of you shooting me, I've got more of a problem.
But somewhat, maybe a middle ground in terms of...
There's no middle ground.
Those are your two choices. I mean, that would be a great comedy show. You either agree or you shoot me.
Yeah.
Maybe not fatally, just in like the knees with a paintball gun. But just as you were saying, and we'll wrap this up soon, but just as you were saying about punching down vulnerable groups and people who are disenfranchised, there are obviously disenfranchised groups, but collectively there is still a voice, isn't there? And with the advent of the power of social media and the ability to speak collectively, then you can say something in response. That comedian might have the microphone for that particular moment, but there can be a collective response to that, to say, this isn't funny, to say, you need to change your opinions, just to say that's complete nonsense, that isn't true, isn't there? I mean, that is still the power of freedom of speech, is just as much as you can say what you want, we can say what we want in return to that.
It's funny that you say that, because the people that are saying the bad things that then people have an uproar on Twitter. So like a comedian makes a joke about a disenfranchised group, that group, say on Twitter, has something to say about it. Like the comedian really hits back hard rather than having any kind of introspection and like looking upon themselves, being like, maybe I said a bad thing, maybe I should just apologize. It seems like a lot they just double down and go, nope, I am allowed to say what I want. There are no repercussions to anything, freedom of speech. So it seems kind of, I don't know, it's weird. I think James Acaster, like in his, especially in 2019, when he talks about Ricky Gervais making jokes about the trans community, he makes a very good point when he says, you know who's long been overdue a challenge? The trans community. Like, it really does nail on the head. Like, do you have to make like jokes about the trans community? Can't you find another community to make fun of? Like people with, I don't know, loads of money and houses and the people making all the money from the energy crisis. Like, maybe you could punch at them for a little bit. Just try it. Maybe. And then we'll see what happens. But no, they always double down and keep thinking that what they've said's hilarious. So I don't know.
Just to wrap this up then, Octavia, I just wanted to finish along this line of, I hate this word, but banter. When does banter become offensive? And I think of that from a kind of in a workplace perspective, or, you know, within a community as well, because laughter is the great universal trait for everybody, isn't it? But probably so is bullying as well. But so when does banter overstep the mark?
Oh, it's a good one. I think banter oversteps when you then become offensive. And it's really hard because everybody's so different. So somebody might come to me and banter with me about something, and you might not find it funny, but I find it hilarious. Or somebody who looks just like me, let's say my sister, say the same joke, she might not find it, funny. So I think there's really a thin line. It's a very, very thin line. Know your audience, I guess, is the important thing. No, you can't just banter to anybody and everyone because you just don't know how it's just going to be perceived. In the workplace, I don't think I've ever really experienced banter. I think everybody's just a bit scared of it because, you don't want to offend somebody and you don't want that to then have repercussions where the person goes to HR and then, it can get a bit messy. So I would just say there's a really extreme thin line when it comes to banter.
Yeah. Well, before this ends up in a complaint to HR, let's wrap this up right now. I want to thank you all for being here today. Thank you very much. The question was just, what can you laugh about? I think the answer is probably everything, but it depends on the gag that's told about it. Can we all agree on that, maybe?
I think so, yeah.
Context.
Now we're all cancelled.
And that's the last you heard from us all. Paul Wragg, Octavia, Maparura, and as well Tom Clemance, thank you for being our guest on today's Lificast. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.